pretty well every single president since Jimmy Carter has got entangled in the Middle East in ways that have not worked out well for him.
Donald Trump's decision to attack Iran's nuclear facilities was remarkable on so many fronts. It confounded America's isolationists, who'd assumed he was one of them. It demonstrated that American military power was still the most formidable in the world. It aligned America with Israel in its assault on Iran. It committed America to further attacks on Iran alongside Israel should the Tehran regime retaliate. It was powerful proof of Trump's determination that Iran must never have a nuclear capability. And despite earlier denials to the contrary, it opened the door to regime change. So what does President Trump do next? You never quite know. But let's speak to a man who might. Jerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. Jerry, good morning to you in New York. Let me ask you this first of all. There's been quite a lot of stuff about how the MAGA base is divided about what Trump has done in Iran. But is it not true to say that opinion polls show the MAGA base is behind him, and that part of the base which isn't, like Marjorie Greene Taylor, Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson, is the lunatic fringe?
I think that's broadly right, Andrew. Yes, look, there's no question that there's a lot of support for this. More broadly, there's the MAGA base. MAGA is Donald Trump. I mean, let's be clear about that. The Donald Trump, this attempts to sort of impose some kind of ideological construct onto Trump, which many people have tried to do over the years. You know, is it populism? Is it isolationism when it comes to things abroad? It's really whatever Donald Trump says and does and thinks. And the vast majority of the MAGA base invest tremendous amounts of faith and confidence in his ability to do the right thing. If he had said, I'm not going to bomb Iran, you can guarantee the vast majority of the MAGA base would be with him. And now that he's decided he would bomb Iran, and he has done, they're with him on that too. There is that. All that said, there is a portion of the Republican Party, and you've just mentioned three of the more prominent, if slightly eccentric, names in it, that is skeptical, and understandably so, about America getting into foreign wars. Let's be honest. I wrote in my Times column last week, Andrew, that pretty well every single president since Jimmy Carter has got entangled in the Middle East in ways that have not worked out well for him, with the possible single exception of George H.W. Bush. And even then, he left Saddam Hussein in place, and that came back to haunt the United States. So there is concern, and there is, I think, legitimate concern being expressed. Some of the people I've spoken to and been messaging back and forth in Washington in the last 24 hours, that there's a kind of blithe approach to this, that, this is a surgical strike. It's, been very incredibly successful. The problem is the other side, as you know, in a war, the other side gets to have its turn. And nobody quite knows what Iran's going to do. Nobody really knows where this is going to go. Donald Trump would like this to be one and done, as they say over here in America. He'd like it to be over. But the fear of escalation is there. So there's no question Republicans as a whole, and indeed the nation, will support Donald Trump, at least for the time being, we will see as things unfold over the next few days whether that support holds.
It also means that Mr. Trump has aligned America with Israel for military action if there is a major Iranian response. Now, we don't know what that's going to be yet. We don't even know if there'll be one. We don't even know if Iran really has a capability now to do very much by way of retaliation. But if there is, from what Mr. Trump said, there's more where this comes from. It'll be even worse. So on that, if it is continuing, I think probably for the first time ever, in terms of military action, it looks like America and Israel would be deployed together against Iran.
That's certainly the implication of what we saw at the weekend, Andrew. And again, the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was asked directly about whether there was coordination with Israel at their press conference yesterday. They kind of avoided answering that, I thought, in a very interesting way. They didn't want to be, obviously they want it's the United States. The United States doesn't take orders from anybody and doesn't need to work with anybody if it likes to, but doesn't have to. So they very carefully avoided that question about whether they were coordinated. They said, obviously they made sure they weren't in the same airspace as Israeli planes when they did the bombing. So, but the reality is, you're right. The United States is in a war with Israel, which is a position that although Israel is its strong ally, it has avoided that over the years. And in fact, under many presidents of both parties, it has tried often to play the role of a honest broker, if you like. And a lot of people in the region don't really believe that. But when it came to the Palestinian problem, when it comes to issues such as Donald Trump himself and the Abraham Accords in his first term, he's trying to play both sides, or many sides as there are in that region. Here, the United States is directly allied with Israel against Iran. Now we're going to have to see what that means again in practice. There is, again, people I've been talking to in the last 24 hours think there's a pretty good chance Iran may not directly respond against the United States.
Yes.
But will continue its offensive against Israel. Will continue to find missiles against Israel. Israel will maybe try to find other ways. And that poses an interesting challenge to the United States, because if the US is not directly under attack, then the risk there of escalation, or the reason for it to escalate, is not really very powerful. So we'll see how that plays out. But yes, for the time being, the US is allied in this war.
Is it regime change? Of course, is it a bad name after Iraq and even after Afghanistan to some extent as well? And no one, as I understand it, is talking about boots on the ground in Iran. But is there a view, or is there a strategy in America where from the outside it can do certain things that will make an already rattled regime in Iran that bit more rattled, and therefore it might just topple over? We don't know.
I think people are very, very cautious about that. I mean, people, I should say, other than the President of the United States, who, of course, as you probably saw, did post last night.
Indeed.
Hours after his own vice president had said this is not about regime change.
I saw that.
Well, maybe MAGA, I think is the phrase now, right? Make Iran great again. Make Iran great again. Talking about a regime. Look, everybody I speak to, Andrew, is extremely cautious about that. Not only because pulling, exactly as you say, the US history of effecting regime change in some of these countries is not very good, but also because there's no real certainty, of course, what would follow. Even if you could do it, and there's no as you say, they're not going to put boots on the ground. Targeted assassinations are technically out for the United States. Maybe Israel could do it, but it seems pretty difficult for the US to do it. But even if it could, even in the unlikely event that you could find a way to do it, there's a lot of caution about what might come next. Everybody seems to think here that the most likely post Ayatollah regime would be the Republican Guard, some sort of hardliner in the Republican Guard. And that may not change the nuclear ambitions. That may not change the wider context. So I think for all kinds of reasons, the United States, other than the President of the United States, when he wakes up, when he goes to bed at night, is not talking about regime change.
But if there was a change of government, but it was, as you've just described it, not that much of an improvement. It was a hardline government just without the mullahs this time, and just with the Republican cut. Wouldn't that mean that Israel, with the backing of support of America, it would keep pummeling Iran, would it not?
I think that's very likely. Yes, I mean, I think to the Revolutionary Guard, I should have said rather.
Yes.
I think the chances are. Look, I think one of the legitimate questions here, Andrew, that you're doubtless asking all your guests is what is the end game here?
Yes.
If it's not regime change, I think there is some. I think I know the hope in Washington is that Iran will come to the table and say, as they say here, cry uncle, which is, okay, you've battered me enough. I've had enough. I'm going to come and negotiate, and maybe we can do some sort of a deal whereby we, abjure uranium enrichment and a nuclear weapon for 25 years or something like that. I think something like that would be acceptable to Donald Trump. It'll be interesting whether or not that would be acceptable to Israel. So that's the hope. But a hope is not a strategy. And if Iran does continue to fight and continues to resist, then, and by the way, we've seen, as you've reported, some wider Israeli targeting seems to be going on in Tehran today, hitting the prison, hitting various other things. Yes. It'll be interesting in terms of what we learn about where at some point in the next day or so, we will get these battle damage assessments from the US about what they think they did to these nuclear facilities over the weekend. And if, some people fear, they did enormous damage, but they certainly didn't wipe it out. Does that mean that either the United States or more likely Israel or both continue to pound Iran? I think the chances, again, we don't know what the end game here, and until until the Iranians surrender, which I think is pretty unlikely, then the chances are that this will go on.
I've just come back from the States, Jerry, and I was struck by how little opposition for such a controversial move as bombing Iran, how little opposition there is. Either the MAGA base, as you've explained, has been squared, and the Democrats just seemed all over the place. The left of the Democrats are calling for Mr. Trump to be impeached, which is obviously ridiculous. Some are wondering maybe we should back Mr. Trump. After all, it's a horrible regime in Tehran. And others are attacking him. And then they think, well, hold on, that puts us on the same side as the isolationists and Steve Bannon's. Maybe we don't want to go down that road. They are just in a mess.
Yes, they are. Look, I think to put it absolutely cynically, I think the view of a lot of Democrats, some of the ones that I've spoken to anyway, is that this probably won't succeed in, bringing, if Iran surrenders and we get, a Jeffersonian democracy in Iran by the end of the year, then okay, Donald Trump is king of the world, right? But most people, I think that won't happen. Democrats certainly think it won't, and they think that the risk is that the U.S. will get drawn further into some kind of a conflict again, not with boots on the ground, but with potentially with attacks on the United States itself. God forbid there should be an attack on the U.S. homeland by some terrorist group. I think that many Democrats are playing that long game. They think this isn't going to be successful, that it will make the United States less safe, and that people will then turn on Donald Trump and say, what the heck were you doing? And, obviously, if that did happen, I think the chances are those would be the political consequences. But it's a difficult position to be in, of course, Andrew, because, they don't want to be rooting for the opposition to go to war. So they're torn between expressing support for the president in a military action, condemning him for not doing it with congressional authorization, which he probably didn't really need, but perhaps he should have done, and between warning about those potential consequences, which could be very damaging. So yeah, they're in that kind of difficult position. I think, to be honest, to be fair, that any opposition party is always in when the country goes to war. Do you absolutely give it full-throated, full-hearted support, or do you sort of point out, actually, this may be risky and we shouldn't do that, and we could end up regretting it?
Jerry, we'll leave it there, but thanks for coming on today, marking our card. Jerry Baker from the Wall Street Journal.